Young voters could very well be what swings this election, and you've probably seen the various polls implying that Donald Trump is doing better amongst voters younger than 35 than would be expected, even in some polls seeming to be leading in this category. Now that's obviously very consequential, and you're probably wondering, well, why? Why is it that the Republican candidate is doing so much better than they typically do? And in particular, Donald Trump, who doesn't seem to have much in terms of personality or policy that would be appealing to young voters. Well, I want to take a look at the polls, and there's quite a bit of bad news for Joe Biden. There's a little bit of good news too. As in everything, it's a mixed picture, but here is what the picture actually looks like. So this is a Harvard Youth poll. It's over 2,000 18 to 29-year-olds. And they found that unlike some of these other polls, Biden is still leading amongst these voters, 50 to 37% among registered voters, 56 to 37% among likely young voters. So he's doing better than he was amongst that group in some other polls. But there was, let's see, a USA Today Suffolk University poll back in January that found that among registered voters under 35, in that case, Trump actually leads 37 to 33. And that drew a lot of headlines at the time because one would think that if that is actually what the result is on election day, then the rest of this is pretty much a formality. But again, it's complex. And it's not just the overall level of support that these candidates have that matters if you're trying to figure out how candidates could turn the situation around. You have to dive into the actual policies, and thankfully the poll can actually do that. So it looks like the loss of support that Joe Biden has faced among young voters can largely be traced to a couple of issues, not just to these issues. The economy is important too, but the Israel-Gaza situation and immigration are two issues that these young voters have very strong opinions about. And so they're very, very strong opinions when it comes to the possibility of having a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. By a 5-1 margin, they support it, which is, honestly, I would have guessed that they would be largely supportive, but even I would not have guessed that they would be so overwhelmingly supportive. And you can interpret that in a couple of different ways. You can say that, they have more compassion for the people of Gaza. Maybe, because they're younger, they haven't, been around through decades of, let's keep it real, some propaganda around what America's position vis-a-vis Israel should be. But it could also be sort of a generalized anti-war sentiment. I mean, they grew up during these multiple conflicts that just dragged on for years and years. So maybe they have less of an appetite for it, but that's the situation we're in. And so if you're Joe Biden and you're considered to not be doing a very good job when it comes to that conflict, and this is an issue that not only are people fairly unified for, but they care a lot about, then that's going to hurt you. And the interesting thing about it is not only is he at 33% approval on the handling of the conflict, 57% disapproval, but when you ask this is not just young voters, by the way, it does include young voters. Overall, people think that Trump would do a better job. And the interesting thing about that is, we know exactly what job Donald Trump would do if he was president right now. You would be lucky to find a structure taller than 6 to 8 inches standing in Gaza after a few months if Donald Trump becomes president. So, but the thing is, if you're a young, and again, that's not just young people, but if you're a young person, you might say, okay, well, Biden probably could do a better job, but he isn't doing much. And that frustration builds month after month, and that is going to bother people, and it should. Now, that's not the only topic that actually matters. Immigration is also one that young voters talk about quite a bit. And what's interesting is that this is a bit of a mixed bag too, in that 53% of young Americans think there is a crisis at the southern border, and that's certainly what they've heard on the media. But 50% agree that immigrants improve the culture of the US, and 45% oppose the construction of a wall. So that is a very interesting group because they seem to understand that something needs to happen. The number of crossings is up, but they don't necessarily believe that the extreme MAGA solution of setting up concentration camps all along the southern border is the solution of it. And the interesting thing is many of them probably would have been happy to see that border security bill pass. Even if they don't necessarily understand a lot of what's in it and the fact that it is slanted towards the Republican position on these issues, it would at least reassure them that something is being done. The question is, will they see the Republican successful efforts to sabotage that bill? Will that make them more mad at the Republicans? Or will they just be mad about the situation and put the blame on Joe Biden, who's the president, while the situation is going on? So the reason that we focus on these two issues is not to say that the other issues don't matter. Obviously, job prospects, the prospects of being able to own a home, these are things that young people are thinking about a lot too. But these are two areas where hypothetically Joe Biden could, if he was so inclined, change his stance enough to maybe reassure some people. And based on the polling, although it seems to be trending in his direction with young voters, he still has a lot to do to get back to the numbers he was at in 2020. And in a race that's almost certainly going to be super close, come down to a couple thousand votes in a couple states, I don't think he can afford to just leave those votes behind. So this is kind of a warning for Joe Biden and should be interpreted as such. Members make a difference here at TYT. You help make the show happen, and we see you in the chat with your loyalty badge. Click the join button to become a member today.